Hello, everyone. Before we get started, I want to let you know that this program is being recorded and will be available on the Dyckman Farmhouse Museum website and YouTube page after this presentation. Welcome to the Dyckman Farmhouse Museum's virtual lecture series talking about race matters. Join the conversation. My name is Melissa Kiebit, and I'm the executive director of the museum. We are thrilled to continue this series that commenced in August of 2020 and was so well received that we have extended it to a biannual series. We appreciate the return of our loyal attendees and extend a warm welcome to those who are joining us for the first time. This series was initiated during a tumultuous period marked by the tragic deaths of unarmed Black individuals in the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic. Our aim has always been to foster dialogue and unity on a subject that can sometimes be challenging. This session of Talking About Race Matters is a 3-week series centered around fashion and creative self-expression. Our presenters will explore those topics, beginning with the period of enslavement in the United States and ending with present-day influences in fashion. I wanted to point out a few things about Zoom to ensure that your questions and comments are answered. If you have any technical assistance questions, you can ask Caroline, our digital content and programs manager, any questions using the Q&A feature. Likewise, if you have any questions during the lecture for the speaker, please also use the Q&A, and at the end, we will answer those questions. The Dyckman Farmhouse Museum would like to thank everyone for participating in our second presentation of this spring's Talking About Race Matters lecture series. The overwhelming response to this lecture series makes it clear that there is a need for platforms that allow us to talk about issues that divide us and issues that unite us as Americans. The Dyckman team believes our programming should be accessible to all, and this means that we strive to make as many of our programs as possible free of charge. And as a small nonprofit organization, we rely heavily on grants and donations to support this mission. Tonight, we are joined by Monica Miller, the Ann Whitney Olin Professor of English and Africana Studies at Barnard College. Monica will discuss the politics of fashion and dress for enslaved and free Black people in 18th and 19th century Europe and America. Beginning with the phenomenon of dandified luxury slaves in 18th century London, Miller will discuss the way in which the enslaved and free in America used fancy dress and fashion to both visualize freedom and critique contemporary hierarchies of race, gender, class, and sexuality. This talk is based on Miller's book, Slaves to Fashion, A Cultural History of Black Dandyism, which uses print culture, colonial histories, literature, and theater to tell the Black dandy story. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce Monica Miller presenting Fashion, Race, Identity, and Power, Black Dandy Beginnings. Thank you, Monica.
Thank you, Melissa. And I'd also like to thank Caroline for inviting me tonight to speak with you. I'm grateful for this opportunity to share my work in this venue in particular, as some of what I am be talking about tonight did actually happen in my hometown in southeastern Connecticut, which had its heyday in the 18th century. I'm also in really excellent company in this series. I enjoyed last week's talk about African head wraps, and I'm really looking forward myself to next week's talk by Elizabeth Way on contemporary African-American fashion and fashion designers. So I'm going to share my screen and we can get started. Okay. I'll start with this epigraph. I ask you to note how, within the Black repertoire, style, which mainstream cultural critics often believe to be the mere husk, the wrapping, the sugarcoating on the pill, has become itself the subject of what is going on. Think of how these cultures have used the body as if it was, and often it was, the only cultural capital we had. We have worked on ourselves as the canvases of representation. And that is from Stuart Hall, an essay called What is the Black in Black Popular Culture? Wait, wrong way. I'll stay there. Okay. Contemporary examples of Black high style, particularly Black urban style, are ubiquitous. But the history of Black dandyism and its origins in 18th and 19th century Europe and America is less well known. This history begins in part with the contact between Africans and Europeans that initiated the trade in slaves. In order to survive the inhumanity of the slave trade, those Africans transported to England, America, or the West Indies had to fashion new identities and make the most out of the little that they were given or allowed to retain. Significantly, their new lives nearly always began with the issuance of a new set of clothes. The Travel Journal of William High Grove, and from 1732, records a scene of contact in Virginia in which clothing, or a lack thereof, communicates a great deal about status. He says, "The men are stowed before the foremast, the boys between that and the mainmast, the girls next, and the grown women behind the mizzen. The boys and girls were all stark naked, so were the greatest part of the men and women. Some had beads about their necks, arms and waists, and a rag or a piece of leather the bigness of a fig leaf. And I saw a woman who had come aboard to examine the limbs and soundness of some she seemed to choose. Dr. Dixon bought 8 men and 2 women, and brought them on shore with us all stark naked. But when we had come home, they had coarse shirts and afterwards drawers given to them." While this dire entry hardly seems anticipatory of a contemporary moment of Black sartorial agency, it does in fact contain important elements that transform degrading aspects of this scene into a story of Black dandy origins. Some had beads about their necks, arms, and waists, and a rag or piece of leather the bigness of a fig leaf. While not clothing proper, these pieces of jewelry and other accessories hold within them the power of memory, of a place of autonomy as the only material retention from former lives in Africa. It is small objects like these, precious or shiny bits of beads and ribbons, that the enslaved often collected and used to augment their standard issue coarse shirts and drawers. The accumulation of objects of personal adornment and the nature of their display mattered to materially deprived African captives who used clothing as a process of remembrance and a mode of distinction, and symbolic and sometimes actual escape from bondage, which I'll say more about in a minute, in their new environment. The procurement of fine clothing and accessories could be important to African captives is evidenced by the need of those who absconded or self-emancipated to have a traveling wardrobe. In Virginia in 1769, an enslaved man named Joe, a genteel and active fellow, who had always been kept as a gentleman's waiting man, his hair combed very nicely, who could ride a good hand, escaped on a fine horse with a large bundle of clothes and other things with him, including a blue overcoat and breeches, a lead-colored cloth coat and vest with metal buttons, a silver-laced hat, several summer vests, white shirts and stockings, of which some are silk. Clad in such finery, Joe rode toward the shore, where, as he told some people he met on his journey, he hoped to get a ship to London and live as a legally free man. Here, dress and fashion are practically and symbolically important to the enslaved sense of individuality and liberty. Captives described as remarkably fond of dress often style out to signal or reach their own imperatives. As the Atlantic began to connect Blacks and whites in unprecedented ways, Black people expressed their own sense of style in relation to that which they perceived was operating in the European societies in which they were traded or which they lived. On the bodies of those on the African coast and those imported into America and England, a negotiation of identity was taking place, a visual and visible sign of how Africans cast into a diaspora would have to construct their identities literally and materially. Black dandyism played a signal part in this process. The Oxford English Dictionary defines a fop from the 15th century as one foolishly attentive to and vain of his appearance, dress, or manners, and a dandy by 1780 as one who studies above everything else to dress elegantly and fashionably. Anyone can be in vogue without apparent strategy, but dandies commit to a study of the fashions that define them and an examination of the trends around which they continually redefine themselves. Dandyism is a manipulation of the relationship between clothing, identity, and power. Styling out is an interrogative practice, especially when practiced by the enslaved and marginalized. It asks questions about race, class, gender, sexuality, and nation. Dandyism afforded Africans and later African Americans and Afro-Europeans an opportunity to dress their way from slavery to freedom, to restyle given categories of identity, to turn slaves into selves. This is as true for those who were dressed themselves, as well as those who were dressed in silks and turbans, whose challenge was to inhabit the clothing in their own way. Tonight, I'd like to examine 3 Black dandy figures, historical and fictional, who can be seen understanding, manipulating, and reimagining the construction of their images through the dandy's signature method, a pointed redeployment of clothing, gesture, and wit. Black dandies may seem to mimic European dress styles in an effort to accrue the power associated with whiteness. Such repetition, however, is never a strict copy of the original style, but a Black interpretation of it, designed to offer the dandified performer a greater sense of mobility and creativity within the form. The dandy's power and potential should be read on a continuum between complete subversion to or transcendence of authoritative aesthetics. Slavish swells. In 17th and 18th century England and earlier in continental Europe, Black boys and Black men were sometimes luxury items, collected like any other signifier of wealth and status. Historian of Black Britain Peter Fryer uses the word vogue to describe the period of their celebrity in British history, approximately 1650 to 1800, evidencing the fact of their status as commodities subject to the whims of fashion. Those privileged and wealthy enough to participate in New World exploration or the slave trade, directly or indirectly, began the trend of keeping Africans as entertainment, curiosities, and sometimes surrogate sons. In almost all cases, these enslaved boys were clothed in splendid and at times bizarre liveries. At first the plaything of royalty, Black boys quickly became an affectation for the lower orders of elite society. They were, at the time, fashion forward. What made these enslaved boys conspicuous was in large part the irony-laden dichotomy of their status as debased, non-laboring beings in uniforms of sumptuous dress, perfect examples of conspicuous consumption. A Black boy might find himself in, this is from the time period, a blue livery suit trimmed with narrow, closely woven braid of silk or gold, or silver thread called a galloon and lined with orange cloth, with silk fringed sleeves and a gold galloon facing, or maybe a fustian frock with yellow metal buttons, a blue livery coat lined with red with yellow metal buttons, a red waistcoat, breeches and stocking, and a hat laced with silver orris or a kind of gold or silver lace. Clad in such garish but expensive outfits, or in oriental apparel, complete with turban and feather, these Black people were meta objects, whose dress primarily communicates a wealth and cosmopolitanism not necessarily their own. These Black boys were part of an exotic display designed by the elite to feel wealthier, more powerful, ultra-modish, through a process of ornamentalizing and displaying the African abject. Despite their spectacularity, relatively little attention has been paid to how such a practice affected Black self-perception and representation. Seeing how Black boys were packaged as prestige items also reveals the raw material they could use to imagine themselves and reinvent their images personally and politically. Sumptuary laws enacted to check the magnificence of livery suggest that the servant clothing did indeed establish and disturb social hierarchies. Though enslavers seemingly employed livery to control their own status as well as that of their servants, their efforts at doing so were undone by the very phenomenon they sought to employ, the notoriously capricious world of fashion. One can imagine that an amusingly dressed little Black boy might have been treated like a family member, a cherished retainer, or a plaything. The volatility of their position can be discerned from the fate of one of their number, Julius Soubise, who's caricatured here as the Mungo macaroni. A mid-18th century celebrity, he was a participant rather than merely a forced patron in the current trends of commodity culture, of visibility, luxury, and fashion. Soubise is among the first Black dandies that I was able to identify in an Anglo-American context. Born in St. Kitts and brought to England as a slave in 1764, he was the most visible and famous of the Black servants who animated late 18th century London during the height of the trade in slaves and other imperial goods. Freed and adopted by the Duchess of Queensberry, he was trained in the genteel arts and became an athlete, an entertainer, a coach, a ladies' man, and a quite visible member of the emerging Black community. As such, he was theatrical, spectacular, and a complication to perceived perceptions of Blackness, and especially Black masculinity and sexuality. He was often clad in a powdered wig, white silk breeches, very tight coat and vest with enormous white neckcloth, white silk stockings, and diamond-buckled red-heeled shoes. At the time, fops were regarded as treasonous men on a number of levels. They were not manly enough, authoritative enough, or English enough, and thus traitors to class, gender, and country. When racialized as Black, the fop is even more outrageous and seemingly appealing. Despite and because of his appearance and behavior, Soubise was loved and admired by all until, and this is a quotation from the period, he suddenly changed his manners and became one of the most conspicuous fops in town. Around age 19, Soubise transformed himself from a Black man in fop's clothing to a fop who was Black. Of course, the transition from one to the other was hardly smooth and somewhat impossible to complete in an age of slavery. Rumored to have taken a private apartment, he soon assumed the habits of an extravagant man of fashion, which included entertaining visitors in rooms filled with hothouse flowers, pursuing women via song and poetry, taking boxes at the opera. He joined expensive men's clubs, and he rode around town in his own post-chaise and four, driven by a white groom. An extravagant version of his livery brother, Soubise seemed to capitalize on his forced spectacularity and the Duchess of Queensberry's generosity or largesse, becoming for a time what 18th century Londoners would call a personage. His behavior was noted in the society press, which is where these quotations come from, and recorded in the diaries of the temps, caricatured by conservative critics who were bemused and befuddled about this Black man's antics in the age of slavery and imperialism. Soubise's tale begins and ends in boundary crossings. While his biographers treat the incident differently, they all mention that his years as London's most colorful and foppish cad ended when Soubise was sent abroad to mend his wild ways from the high life of the rakes. According to some, he actually left to hush up his rape of, or some say liaison with, one of the Duchess's maids. Considered an Othello, he was called Othello from an early age, his sexuality was as much on display as his color or foreignness. He was made into an object whose own subjectivity had to be ignored and policed. For Soubise and all the enslaved and servants, whether they labored in the fields, in country houses, or within a system of social and cultural signs, the subjugation of their race is absolutely dependent on the disciplining of their sexuality and sometimes their gender expression. A man whose very body and its adornment in lace and silks embodied the confused desires of the British elite, Soubise could not or would not be allowed to spread that confusion further. He was forced into exile and sailed for Calcutta in July of 1777. He lived for 21 years running his own fencing and riding school before he was killed at age 44 by a fall suffered in breaking a horse for the British government in India. And this is a caricature of him fencing with the Duchess of Queensberry. As such, Black dandy origins in the spaces, the Black dandy originates in spaces between hypervisibility and invisibility, between luxury and labor, between the expression of pleasure and the policing and controlling of desire. Black dandies are victims and perpetrators of what I have called crimes of fashion. Crimes of fashion cut both ways. They are dehumanizing and potentially a means by which the agency and subjectivity of Black subjects can be imagined and produced. Soubise himself was at once the victim of a vogue, as well as a traitorous trendsetter himself. 2 Negro governors. At stake in the perpetration of a crime of fashion by or on a Black dandy is the status of who is or who can appear as a gentleman. This question became a signal concern as Black people transitioned from enslavement to freedom in the 19th century. This phenomenon took many different forms and depended in part on demographics. In 18th century London, Black dandy antics could be dismissed as folly, given the relatively small Black population in the city at the time. Nevertheless, that Soubise often held court in coffee houses where his fellow Blacks were bought and sold indicates the seriousness of this folly for all concerned. In colonial America, the demographics of slavery differed north to south. Crimes of fashion played very differently in the slaveholding South than they did in the urban and urbanizing North. In the 19th century, crimes of fashion take at least two forms, one in Black and the other in blackface. Exemplified by the class and race cross-dressing festivals of Negro Election Day and Pinkster and the Blackface Minstrel Show, these crimes of fashion are a symbol of self-conscious manipulation of authority, and when performed in blackface, an attempted denigratory parody of free Blacks' pride and enterprise. An integral part of early America's performative culture, annual African-American festivals like Pinkster, a holiday of Dutch origin, and Negro Election Day, an Anglo-African-American affair, featured class and race cross-dressing characteristic of the Black dandy. By performing who they were and who they were becoming by means of fashion and style, early African Americans redefined constricting markers of identity as they literally and symbolically changed clothes. Pinkster and Negro Election Day featured parades and dances of the enslaved dressed to the nines in clothing normally reserved for their social and racial betters. Given their ubiquity in the slaveholding Americas, historians have long debated whether or not these performative race and class cross-dressing festivals were more than a simple example of what Frederick Douglass called safety valves to carry off the rebellious spirit of enslaved humanity. For the participants, these events were a release from their respective high and low positions at the same time that they served to increase the culture's awareness of the structural and social inequalities being mocked. As early as the 1750s, Election Day festivities of the majority population began to include Black participation. Negro Election Day was celebrated by the Black enslaved and free, who were, according to a 19th century authority, peculiarly alive to the effect of pomp and ceremony in the white elections. Blacks not only made every effort to be present, but the imitative instinct stirred in them to elect a governor for themselves. Black Election Day, like the white, was accompanied by speeches before and after the voting, a parade in fancy dress or military gear commemorating the change of office, and dinner and dancing. Originally a religious holiday associated with Pentecost or Whitsuntide, Pinkster traveled to America with the Dutch settlers and continued to be celebrated in New York when New York came under British rule. Pinkster was a multicultural affair from the beginning, a holiday for enslavers, the enslaved, Black and white free people, and indigenous people. However, by 1800, it was organized by Blacks and included actual and symbolic bids for cultural authority, as the festival featured the crowning of a Black Pinkster king and a parade accompanying him to the festival grounds, a market, carnival, and other entertainments. The dress of the participants in these festivals visualized their potential parodic nature. Had they intended a faithful and unironic imitation of whites, the participants would have aimed for more precision in their apparel. Instead, they are reported to have worn uniforms, anything but uniform, and outfits in which the haphazard dominated as they were matched with an African eye for color, ensembles of real style and flair, and that's from the period. The dress of the enslaved in the festivals indicated that the drama was one in which culture was not merely being copied, but rather negotiated on the backs of the participants. A tone of mock seriousness pervaded, turning imitation into parody. All involved in the festivities, Black and white, were satirized. African-American governors and their constituents, Pinkster kings and their subjects were a little off, and hilariously and strategically so. Witness this account of the most famous Pinkster king, Old King Charles or Charlie, an African from Angola, at Pinkster celebrations in Albany in the early 1800s. Never, if our memory serves us, shall we forget the mingled sensations of awe and grandeur that were impressed on our youthful minds when first we beheld his stately form and dignified aspect, slowly moving before us and approaching the center of the ring. His costume on this memorable occasion was graphic and unique to the greatest degree, being that worn by a British brigadier of the olden time. Ample broadcloth scarlet coat with wide flaps almost reaching to his heels, and gaily ornamented everywhere with broad tracings of bright golden lace. His small clothes were of yellow buckskin, fresh and new, with stockings blue and well-burnished silver buckles to his well-backed shoe. When we add to these tri-cornered cocked hat, trimmed also with lace of gold, which so gracefully set upon his noble globular plate, we nearly complete the rude sketch of the Pinkster King. Charlie's colorful, ill-fitting, spectacular uniform satisfies and plays with multiple expectations of the audiences he serves: African, African-American, recently British, newly American. As an Angolan in pieces of British dress uniform and presiding over a Black organized, originally Dutch festival with clear African religious elements, he approaches a ring to dance some version of the ring shot, a circular dance of West African origin. Old King Charlie represents the bricklayer style and cultural performativity of the African enslaved and early African Americans. Africans may have arrived in America physically and metaphorically naked, but they had likely not forgotten the customs and aesthetic practices that had governed their lives in Africa. The clothing of the enslaved, and especially festivals of the enslaved that involve clothing and performativity, displays this intersection of memory, creativity, and becoming. Their play with clothing helped them and others to see and accessorize the space between seeming and being. Black dandyism in early America combines notions of self-respect and agency with a knowingness about the way in which visibility and consumption affect regard of the self and group. Though read as simple imitation by most whites, the urge of all Blacks to indulge themselves in finery would have been significant in at least two systems: as a possible homage to the not uncomplicated African traditions of displaying status, and as a recognition and potential diffusion and parody of those who held the same status in America. Even if they were not able to control the initial process in which they dress, the enslaved could define their own style in mending, maintaining, and otherwise adding to their often meager wardrobes. In addition to flourishes achieved by bright colored dyes, silver and gold buttons, brilliant ribbons, the closets of the enslaved were improved through shopping and shoplifting from enslavers. Advertisements of self-emancipating slaves record innumerably clothing thefts and identify specific enslaved people by their love of dress and fashion. This is from Parker's Weekly, 1762. £5 reward, run away on Monday the 12th instant from me, the subscriber, a mulatto man named Charles. He is a likely well-set fellow, 28 to 30 years of age and about 5 feet 6 inches high, and has the smallpox. He has a variety of clothes, some of them very good, and affects to dress very neat and genteel, and generally wears a wig. He took with him 2 or 3 coats or suits, a dark brown or chocolate-colored cloth coat, pretty much worn, a dun or dove-colored cloth of fine frieze, but little worn, and a light blue-gray summer coat of grogram camblet, and some such stuff, a straw-colored waistcoat edged with silver cord, almost new, and several waistcoats, breeches, a pair of stockings, a blue greatcoat, and a fiddle. His behavior is excessively complacent, obsequious, and insinuating. He speaks good English smoothly and plausibly, and generally with a cringe and a smile. He is extremely artful and ready at inventing specious pretenses to conceal villainous actions or designs. There are so many examples of ads for the absconded who are addicted to dress, remarkably fond of dress, generally dressy, very fond of showy dress, who occasionally dress gay, that one can surmise that clothing and appearance served as marks of true distinction for the enslaved in the period. The enslaved stole clothing not only because it was portable or their only material possession, but also because better clothing allowed them to pass more easily for freemen and to enter the market as consumers. Clothing could be sold, traded, exchanged for other necessary items. From the perspective of enslavers and the enslaved, clothing had significance way beyond functionality. At stake was nothing less than a sense of freedom. The importance of dress is also well illustrated in the fact that whites passed sumptuary laws specifically forbade Black extravagance in colonial and emancipating America. These laws were designed to stop the performativity of identity with clothing, to arrest the exploitation of sartorial semiotics. The best known laws were drafted in Charleston, South Carolina in 1735 and 1740, and New Orleans in 1786. In Charleston, the effort to prevent perceived Black fashion violations or crimes of fashion was wholly ironic, because for some enslavers, especially those involved in illicit relationships with their female captives, they were themselves responsible for the distribution of finery so offensive to their fellow citizens. Additionally, male captives were sometimes punished for their infractions by means of sartorial gender and sexual humiliation. They were made to wear clothing typical for women or inadequate clothing. In the early American household, clothing was a weapon in the struggle for social control, individual agency, and personal integrity. The performativity and visuality that characterized the festivals began to play differently over time due to abolition. The class and racial cross-dressing came to have increased symbolic value as the status mockingly achieved in the festivals, this moment of freedom, actually became theoretically, if not materially attainable for Blacks transitioning to freedom. However, the dandy's import for Blacks and whites alike did not diminish with the end of the festivals. In the 1830s, the crimes of fashion perpetrated by Black dandies were duly punished and perpetrated again, this time on a proper stage. Coincident with the end of the festivals was the rise of America's most enduring Black dandy representation, the urban, super-styled ladies' man Zip Coon, the Black dandy from the Blackface minstrel show. The development of blackface minstrelsy, the most popular entertainment of the 19th century, engendered another set of representational crimes in which fashion and folly played major roles. Dandy Jim from Carolina. As the 19th century progresses, whether on stage in the legitimate theater or frolicking through a minstrel show, the Black dandy was as subject to ridicule as he was to loathing. Foil to Jim Crow, blackface dandies like Zip Coon offered an opportunity to mock Black aspirations beyond the Southern plantation. In particular, a desire for education, respect, and self-determination. Examination of some of the best-known Black dandy characters, Zip Coon, Longtail Blue, and Dandy Jim, from their signature songs in the minstrel show, reveals that the transformation of a figure, a recently emancipated figure gunning for respectability, to a free Black intent on broadcasting Blackness into the public realm would be dangerous. As one of the first blackface acts, Longtail Blue strutted on stage in 1827, newly free, nattily attired, and potentially incarnating a question that hovers over the minstrel show more generally. What if? What if Blacks were free, and not just in the North? What if they had money, access to education, unchecked social, cultural, and economic mobility? Longtail Blue, Dandy Jim, and Zip Coon answered those questions, simultaneously revealing and repressing anxieties about race, class, gender, and sexuality. In asking what if, blackface minstrelsy also broached a question that was also newly haunting 19th century Americans: who can be a gentleman? The answer is given by the minstrel show in the figure of the dandy, suggested that free Blacks, no matter how proper, savvy, educated, and within the law, would not be considered eligible for such a status. The change in the look of the Black community in urban centers like New York and Philadelphia, the result of Black migration to the city, as well as some of the shopping and clothes swapping on arrival, did not go unnoticed. Attempts to control these newly fashionable Blacks ranged from the subtle to the outrageous. Excessive responses included the riot of the minstrel show, as well as ripping the new clothes off the backs of those Blacks dressed beyond what whites could bear. Longtail Blue, Dandy Jim, and Zip Coon have much in common in the way that they approximate or degrade white gentlemanly elegance in their costumes. In Longtail Blue's song, we learn that freedom brought him a new attitude that he expressed with ultra modish clothes featuring tightly fitting pantaloons, a lacy jabot, a silk hat, baubles dangling from his waistband, a lorgnon, which he held up with an effeminate gesture, and occasionally a walking cane. In addition, if there's one thing he could not do without, it was a blue coat with long swishing tails, a symbol of his potential animalism in both body and behavior. Blue pursues white gals, and when caught by the white policeman in his song, he endures a split of his long-tail blue. However, and importantly, the dandy repairs the coat and picks up where he left off, no worse for the temporary punishment, even if it is a metaphor for castration. A narcissist intending to cut a figure at a ball, and in some versions, woo lovely Dinah into bribing him with 8 or 9 young dandy gems of Carolina, Dandy Jim also boasts of a sexual prowess that is definitively linked to his appearance. Unlike Longtail Blue, Dandy Jim's lust remains within his own race and social conventions. Nevertheless, his quest to populate the world with as many little dandies as he can is very threatening, which is an allusion to the song lyrics. Thus, fears of Black freedom and equality that Black dandies embody is not just one in which social equality leads to miscegenation, as in the case of Longtail Blue, but one which seems to equate miscegenation with the threat of mere Black presence and visibility. These dandies menace even as they amuse, revealing the affinity between effeminacy associated with extreme attention to dress and a hypermasculinity that is linked to sexual rapacity that exceeds racial boundaries. What is surprising about Blackface dandies on the minstrel stage is the degree to which they succeed at their plan of insurrection and intermixture. We cannot forget that the gals being pursued here by white men in blackface on the minstrel stage are themselves white men in blackface and drag. In fact, the blackface dandy on stage comes alive in the pursuit and performance of these anxieties about race, gender, and sexuality, and class. Back on the streets, emancipation caused Blacks to examine their own self-identity and image as a group. Signs of social stratification present in the early Black festivals gave way to a full-blown cult of respectability. Elite Blacks in urban centers with the oldest and best established Black populations, especially those in Philadelphia and New York, were extremely concerned with the combating stereotypes, refuting doubts about Negro intelligence, leadership ability, and industriousness. These respectable Black folk offered conservative demure dress and fine fabrics as an outward sign of integrity. This new phase of Black dandyism, designed to prove Blacks' fitness for citizenship, to maintain and refine Black social status, emerged as an affront to elite, middle class, working class, and immigrant whites. Publicly less concerned with assimilation or positive or group self-representation, other Blacks pushed the conjunction of freedom and fashion to another level. These folks dressed flamboyantly as part of a desire to present oneself as individualistically as possible and to obliterate the drudgery and submission required under slavery or the poverty and blasted ambitions of many free Blacks. For this demographic, the struggle for both self-dignity and collective regard was enhanced by a flair for original self-presentation. More important than fabulousness was the communication of it. These Blacks notoriously took their extravagance to the streets, strutting, sauntering, and promenading in public spaces like parks and other natural runways like New York City's Broadway and Fifth Avenue. This styling out, or rejection of decorum set by both whites and the emergent Black middle class, earned the attention of reformers in both groups, but no amount of lecturing by Black or white leaders could suppress the release that the Black underclass found in wearing showy clothing to frolics and balls and drink and other forms of conviviality. This behavior, both the elegance and fabulousness and its public nature, did not go unnoticed or unchecked, even before the minstrel show presented it in blackface. Artists and printmakers, especially Edward Clay, famous for his Life in Philadelphia series, which ran between 1828 and 1830, and his Life in New York series, which was presented in the late 1820s, lampooned Blacks' upwardly mobile lifestyles and grotesque caricatures of supposed Black society. In prints depicting Blacks in elaborate costumes and bourgeois social situations, the artist ridiculed again and again Black pretensions, intellectual capacity, and aspirations. The Blacks were practicing different forms of dandyism, sometimes firmly within social conventions and sometimes independent of respectable society. Parodies assumed them both into a cycle in which racism, sexism, and classism tried to keep up with the various forms that Black agency could take. The importance of the gaze, or those from whose perspective Black fashion and self-fashioning were being judged, was understood even by those who worked to distort Black images. Although his Life in Philadelphia series ended in 1830, 7 years later, Clay issued Philadelphia Fashions, a final print admitting to some degree the power of the newly emboldened Black look. Whereas Clay's earlier Philadelphia series had been voyeuristic, one in which the viewer, presumably white, ridicules Black pretension to high society by eavesdropping on Black social follies and foibles, this print, Philadelphia Fashions, is confrontational. Mr. Augustus's look at the viewer through a monocle magnifies concern about the viewer's own sense of self and forces a comparison of this self with that of the nattily-clad Black man. In the way in which his clothes conform to his body, we see that he earned this elegance, that it fits him properly, that he wears it as a badge of self-worth. Black dandies, especially in this example by Clay, make obvious the fact that a turf war between whites and Blacks, men and women, the higher and lower classes, was taking place in the popular imagination, being worked out on the body and in the streets. The question, who can be a gentleman, is asked here again, and the answer is complicated at best. In conclusion, as a depiction of free Blacks, the dandy image embraced ambivalence and manipulated it into Black style, a self-conscious process of endless resignification. Indeed, in his adaptability, the dandy figure links African traditions and Black subversive play with white power in the colonial period to Black statements of respectability and individuality in freedom. Blackface minstrelsy and other caricatures fought against this mobility, even as they acknowledged the ability of this figure and its real-life counterparts to reinvent themselves. This reinvention took another turn after the Civil War, Reconstruction, and the Great Migration. As the 19th century turned to the 20th, Black dandies and dandyism asked other questions of themselves and the multifarious others also interested and intrigued by clothing, fashion, dress, identity, and power. Thank you. You take some questions.
Yes, I have a couple of questions. First of all, thank you so much. That was wonderful. I was so excited to hear you talk about Pinkster.
I know.
Yeah, Pinkster is something that we've been
Mhm.
trying to do more programming around over the past several years. And so, yeah, I was really excited to hear about that. Okay, I have a couple of questions. Some of them are regarding Pinkster. So
Oh,
you
okay.
mentioned
You can help
that
me out then.
you mentioned that the Pinkster King wore very specific dress. Somebody was wondering, was there any specific dress for women or children during the Pinkster celebration?
Mhm. Um, I can say I don't know that for sure. I can say that for the most part, where we get this information from in terms of what people were wearing often comes from sometimes there'll be a diary entry, or sometimes there will be a little bit of a press notice, right? Or some kind of accounting for that. So most of the time, the the information that I found almost always mentioned men and not women,
Mhm.
right? So old King Charlie or any of the other Pinkster kings were the ones that were being really uh, celebrated. So, I mean, it's hard to know. Sometimes it's not pure celebration at all. Celebrated or noticed, right,
Right.
as the sort of most sartorially extravagant. My guess is that the clothing for women and children would have been most of the time the Black folks who were participating in those festivals often had sort of hand-me-down clothing from from masters and mistresses, right? That would have been, fancy dress that had seen somewhere, right? So they would have been dressed in that kind of finery. But I can also imagine, I mean, given the other instincts that I was talking about, that clothing would have also been augmented, right? Could
Mhm.
have absolutely been augmented with different kinds of buttons, certain forms of lace, ribbons, all of the things that you would use, right, to just distinguish yourself, right, and
Mhm.
to to make a show of it. Yeah.
Yeah, that's interesting. It kind of goes back to when we were talking with Cheney McKnight last week about head wraps and how they were able to, add into their head wraps and using supplementary funds
Mhm.
from different ways that they were able to make money. So that's very interesting.
Yeah.
I guess a question along the same lines as the last one is, did dandyism primarily occur among men, or are there examples of women using fashion in this way as well?
Right. Um, I sort of made a choice when I was doing the research for my book. Um, I made a choice that was one that was sort of dictated to me some of the reasons that I just mentioned, is that it's far more often that men, right, are noticed, right, as participating in this activity, because I think two reasons. I think that in some ways, when Black men, in particular, during the time of slavery, when they would have access to, or gained access to fancy dress, it always, I think you always have to read it as a kind of power politic, right? So
Hmm.
there was a way in which they were being noticed, caricatured, written about, and really sort of imagined, right, as a kind of social anxiety, right? Women, I think, especially during slavery, this changes right after emancipation. Um, I think the enslaved women they did absolutely have access to, as I was saying, some of these sort of cast off clothing that their mistresses would give them. But I do feel that women, they had so much less mobility, right? In terms of their ability to sort of be out in the public and to be noticed, right, as participating in this kind of sort of expressive activity, that there's less recording of them doing these kinds of things. Um, I'm going to say all the way up until the later part of the 19th century. Like it really, because then, as I was sort of implying about the minstrel show, then the anxieties for Black women during abolition and emancipation, and afterwards, becomes about proving respectability, right? So
Hmm.
certain forms of flamboyance would be seen as not respectable. So again, you know, there's the gender politics of this matter a lot. But I do think, though, especially when we get to, say, for example, I was just at the Met exhibition of the Harlem Renaissance, the new exhibition that opened. It's opening this weekend, but I was at a preview last night. By the time you get to the early part of the 20th century, things really change, and there you really do start to see, right, after, as a part of the Great Migration, you really do start to see women, right, really taking advantage of new forms of freedom that come with urbanization, that come with, I mean, sort of the simple fact of, you could, for the first time in Harlem during that time, there was like ready to wear, like ready-made clothing, right? So people weren't
Hmm.
making their own clothing all the time. So things like, it was easier to start with a dress and then do something with it, right? So by the early 20th century, things really change, and then you start to see female dandies who are wearing not only typical feminine dress, but right, but like also wearing masculinized dress, wearing, like, many of the blues legend would um, appear on stage in tuxedo, right? So we get a really different set of concerns around fancy dress, gender, and sexuality in the early 20th century. Yeah.
Another question we have is, what do you think about modern Black dandyism?
Oh, modern Black dandyism. Um, I love modern Black dandyism, and I'm very, and I also think about it on a really wide spectrum. So, I mean, I think it's always been thought about on, I mean, it's always been policed on a wide spectrum, but I actually see it being performed on a very wide spectrum. Like, I'm very interested in, say, for example, bespoke suiting, right? Which I think, I can think of Oswald Boateng, who is one of the tailors who has a atelier on Savile Row in London. Like bespoke suiting that for him, because he's also he's Afro-British, right? So his family has roots in West Africa. So part of what he's doing with that suiting is absolutely a kind of British tradition, but he's also bringing in sort of uh, elements of sort of I'm going to say African sort of high the the understanding of the propriety of certain forms of dress for certain occasions, right? So
Mhm.
that's definitely a part of what he's doing. But that's a very conservative form of Black dandyism. And then there's just a real flamboyance, right? We can even see this. Like I like to look when occasionally there'll be a great article online about the NBA, right? When we see basketball players, right, coming to a particular event, or actually even sort of going into the arena, there's all kinds of forms of Black dandyism that are happening there as well, right? That have to do with like the use of luxury brands, that have to do with sort of certain forms of other forms of suiting, right, that are much more casual and incorporate elements of like sportswear, right? So there's like I see it in many places, right, and I see it in different kinds of forms, and you know I enjoy. I mean, I enjoy that because when I see it, I also see the history of it, right, and I see the
Mhm.
ways in which Black people have for centuries, right, been using as Stuart Hall said at the beginning of my talk, using their bodies as canvases of representation, right, and as of ways to say things about how they're being perceived, how they want to be perceived, their relationship to class, right, their relationship to power, right? So yeah, I'm very into that.
Awesome. Okay. This person says, outstanding information, thank you. Do you think
Mhm.
in the African American community, the consumerism and large investments in clothing, while other more essential needs are lacking in an individual's life, are cultural echoes of this time? As a person of color, as a child, I remember friends had Jordans, but no winter coat.
Yes, this is a major issue, right? When we're thinking about Black dandyism, and yes, I mean, I do think there. I mean, there are elements of that in my own family history as well. So I can see. I see that everywhere as well, and you do have to. I mean, I think it's important to actually understand it in this sort of historical continuum, right? When when consumer culture and consumption, right, come into the story, because I think the beginning of the story that I'm telling is about Black people sort of being consumed, right, and being
Mhm.
objects of conspicuous consumption, and there we might think about what they're doing as related to sort of Black style, right, and because they don't have access to so many other kinds of things, right. When we move a little bit further into the 19th, 20th century and 21st century, right, then I think we're looking also at the vagaries of fashion, right, which is much more tied to the market, right, and turns over very quickly, right. So I do think that you know, fashion and status, right, are things that are categories that have had varying relationships, right, across Black history. So absolutely, I mean, I do think that you know, having Jordans and not a winter coat, or spending more money on a suit, right, for a particular occasion than for some sort of other essential is a part of this. I mean, is another part and another lens, right, of this particular history. But it's also a matter of sort of, I like to think about this phrase of making something out of nothing, right? So some people have recourse to very little, right? So
Mhm.
in terms of making something out of nothing, this process does also have something very much to do with identity perception, with self-fashioning, with thinking aspirationally, even if the reality is really different. We see versions of this happening elsewhere too. In Africa, there's a group of, say, in the Republic of Congo, there's a group of Black dandies there. They're really well known, called the Sapeurs, right? They are very resource poor, right? And these men who participate in this community save up all of their money to buy designer clothing from primarily French haute couture houses, right? And then they sort of parade these clothing. They parade themselves in this clothing in the streets, and they have contests around it. And the clothing is beautiful, for that moment, right? They feel they feel beautiful. They feel empowered, right? They also feel like the way that they modify the clothing, like they're modifying a certain French inheritance, right? There's a lot going on. It's never simple, right? When a Black person will choose a Jordan over a coat or a bespoke suit, right? Over some more over a staple, right? There's so much wrapped up in those choices, right? That are, I think, I don't want to use the language of positive and negative, but it's complicated.
Yeah. Somebody else just asked, in relation to this question, I think, would it also be considered agency through fashion?
Absolutely. Yes. I mean,
Yeah.
that's what I meant, kind of doing something with nothing, right? It's
Yeah.
absolutely about finding agency where you can find it, right? And then also finding agency where you can find it, and also participating, right, um, in a sanctioned, right, authorized, I'm going to say, system of signs, right? And sometimes the authorization comes from like an internal Black community, right? And
Mhm.
sometimes that authorization comes from an external, like white or non-Black community, right? When people style out, they're styling out for different audiences, and sometimes different audiences simultaneously, right? So that kind
Mhm.
of the relationship between the dandy and the viewer, right? And the performer and the audience, right? Really, really matters also in terms of thinking about what what agency is possible, right? And how the person doing this might be able to, not, it's not always guaranteed, might be able to access moments of freedom and liberation, like that feeling.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Apart from fashion, what other codes of respectability have you identified in Black Afrovisual culture?
Ooh, interesting. I'm so focused on fashion. Let's see. Oh, respectability. Oh, I mean, I think it has to do with in visual culture specifically. I think
Mm.
comportment, right? I mean, I look at a lot in my book. I look at some photographs, for example, from historically Black colleges and universities from the late 19th and early 20th century, right? And there, it's not only what people are wearing, but it's how they're carrying their bodies, right? And the
Mm.
ways in which they are posing, and in terms of in relation to each other, right? But also just sort of in general. So I think comportment, right, and posture, right, really matters a lot. Um, and then also kind of relationality within a group can also
Mhm.
really give you a signal, maybe as a viewer, as to sort of like who and what you're looking at, right? And
Mhm.
what it is that those people might value in terms of respectability and wanting to be seen, right, in a particular kind of way. Yeah.
Great. I have one more question that I'm going to add a little bit to, I think. What sources would you recommend to learn more about fashion during Pinkster? Or just, and my part is just
Yes.
what sources maybe to learn more about Black dandyism in general?
Right.
Of course, your book, but what other sources might people be able
Yeah.
to go to?
I think I mean, right now there's so many great, and I mean, Elizabeth Way is also a person who's speaking next week who can answer this question very well. But there has been so much new scholarship and not just academic things, but things that are much more for a more general audience about the relationship between Black people and fashion and Black people and clothing. So I would recommend. I mean, I love this. Book by I'm going to forget her last name, which is ridiculous. Tanisha Ford, called "Dressed in Dreams," which is a kind of it's a more contemporary kind of memoir through clothing, where she really talks about sort of growing up, but also really gets at these issues that we were just talking about the relationship between fashion and agency, right? Especially under circumstances that are not where you don't have the most access to resources, right? So
Yeah.
Dressed in Dreams is a great book. I think there's tons of new work that's coming out on Black fashion designers, including some of Elizabeth Way's work. I can think of, oh, I'm just blanking, but other places. And Pinkster is a little bit difficult one because the
Yeah.
new information is like in these very old journals, right? Very old academic journals that are very dusty. Um, so I think that's a little bit more in terms of popular work related to Pinkster. I think that's more difficult, though somebody should do it because
Yeah.
I think it's time. It's time for thinking about that. Yeah, I'm going to say go to Amazon, although don't buy from Amazon, but go to Amazon because it's a good bibliography and write Black fashion in there and it'll all come up.
Amazon, like Wikipedia, is only a starting point. You don't
It's a
shop
starting
there.
point.
You just look
Exactly.
up things
That's you
there.
look to see what you can get at your local independent bookstore.
Exactly, exactly. That's wonderful. Well, thank you so much for this
Thank you for having me.
discussion. That's all the questions that we have, but this has been absolutely fantastic. I've learned a lot. I can't wait to learn more, and thank you so much.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Yeah. I hope
Enjoy
everyone
Elizabeth.
I hope everyone enjoyed this talk. Please consider making a donation to enable us to continue to offer free public programming. Gifts in any amount are appreciated. I'd like to remind you that this was the second of 3 lectures in our Talking About Race Matters Join the Conversation series. Join us next week, Wednesday, February 28th at 6 p.m. right here on Zoom for Redressing American Fashion, Black Designers in the 19th and 20th Centuries with Elizabeth Way. And be sure to register through the link in the chat and follow us on social media for updates. Thank you and have a great rest of your evening. Thank you so much, Monica. We really appreciate it.
Thank you. Good night.
Good night.